Do you suffer from anxiety, from depression, maybe even chronic pain? Well, listen up. Truth Be Told is going to tell you about a breakthrough program built on over 100 years of therapies used in America's returning veterans to help you successfully overcome PTSD, anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. The secret proven in study after study. Music therapy. The effects of music are nothing short of amazing. From strokes to PTSD, music has been shown to improve the quality of life. Now, one of the latest music therapy programs being used in America's veteran hospitals can be yours to experience for free, at home, and to help your own anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. Or just relax after a hard day. It's called Whole Tones. It takes music therapy to a new level. This revolutionary program makes use of specifically designed frequencies that have been shown to stimulate your body's natural healing power down to a cellular level. If it works for battle-scarred vets, can it work for you? Well, experience it for yourself for free at sweetwholetones.com. Like Tony Sweet, that's S-W-E-E-T. Go to sweetwholetones.com. Now enjoy the show.
What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told. What's your thoughts on...
Hello and welcome to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm your host, Tony Sweet.
And I'm Eddie Connor. Welcome, everybody. Since the beginning of Christianity, we've heard about the Knights Templar, commonly known as the Freemasons today. And to shed light on these societies, we're bringing you an author and historian.
Sanford Holst is best known for his popular books on societies around the world, and he has explored a wide range of history, making us who we are today.
His book, Sworn in Secret, Freemasonry and the Knights Templar, reveals new insights into these secret societies. No matter what you have heard about the Knights Templar or the Freemasons, the reality about them is even more surprising.
Visit sanfordholst.com to find out about his other books that I'm sure will blow your mind.
That's right. So put your hands together, everybody, and please welcome author and historian Sanford Holst.
Okay, we are live here with Sanford Holst in studio. How you doing, Sanford?
Doing just fine.
Well, we are so excited to have you on the show today. This is a topic that I know Eddie and I both get excited about because this show is about not only, we don't really say conspiracy theory anymore. It's just really more like different ideas than what the norm, I guess, out there in our society. And but Freemasonry and Knights Templar, most people have heard of the Freemasons, but they don't really know much about the Knights Templar. So this is a subject for you guys out there. We hope you enjoy. Please leave us comments on our YouTube page and on our iTunes and iHeartRadio, because we want to know what you think about this topic. But first, before we do that, a lot of our audience, they don't know or may not know who Sanford is. So could you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and how did you get interested in the Freemasons?
Well, actually, grew up all over. My father was in the military, so we traveled quite a bit. But born in New York State, lived in Germany for 6 years, Japan for 2 years, 7 different states in the USA. I live in California now, and that's been home for many years. But you know, you don't always choose the things you get into, and this was one of those things. I started off doing other work, nice, sensible jobs, international consulting, just
something, like that.
Yeah, it's not something you have to earn a living. But the thing I found was that I'd loved books and history ever since I was a little kid, although everyone said you can't possibly make a living doing that, so I was doing sensible work. But every place I went, I was having these experiences that gave me something that really charged me up. So I would visit museums, go to local sites, talk to local people, experts about different things, just coming alive with all the things that have happened in the world over the hundreds of years and thousands of years.
Right.
And that eventually got into my first book that I fell into by accident. And after that one sold, I said, this is great. Why not do what you love to do in life? So that's why I'm doing what I do.
And so we were talking earlier about you like to go to museums and different locations around the world. What was one of the first places you went that kind of that little light went off and said, this is something that I want to dive deeper into, find a little bit more about either society or a culture or anything that was just kind of popped into your head that you said, this is what I'm destined to do?
I guess the closest it came to that particular kind of moment was something that I'd actually enjoyed ever since I was a little kid. I'd read in the history books about the Phoenicians that everybody said were the great sea traders and had the purple cloth and all the ships of cedar and all this type of thing. And I really loved that. And then they said, and they're all a mystery. We don't know anything about them. And I thought, that's strange. They sound so fascinating. Why wouldn't we know something about them?
Right.
So it had always been in the back of my mind. And I remember back in the 1970s being down on the south coast of France on the Mediterranean and thinking, I'm just across the water from where the Phoenicians were, and the Phoenicians may have come here at some point, and it just got me thinking about doing something about that. So I started getting into it, and over the years started collecting more and more and more. I wasn't doing any writing at that point, but this is just a love in life. So it was like any place I could find anything about them or visit anything about them was just something I started doing. And that triggered other things. Of course, there were many other things I got excited about over the years, but that was the first one. That really got me going.
Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
And that was Amazon's #1 book on the Phoenicians at one point, right?
Right. It took many years before it became a book.
Well, building. And so what was the title of that?
The title of the book first came out just called Phoenicians. But it's called Phoenician Secrets in the new edition that's out now. But Phoenician Secrets actually came about many, many, many years after that early experience. It's like I was talking to people, you get so excited about something, you go in, you want to talk to the professors and ask them what they know about it. And each one of them said, they're very interesting people, but there's no history there. So you should study.
How can there be no history?
I swear to you, that's what I was told over and over and over. There is no history there. We don't know. Everything's been lost. It's like it's all gone. You're not going to find anything. So study something else, So I took all the stuff I was doing and I put it in a box and put it in the closet. And then a few years later, I'd run across something and I start researching. I said, this is fascinating. This is great. And I start to get excited again. And I go talk to someone else at a different university and they say, well, but there's nothing there. You're not going to find anything. So you may as well forget about it. And so I took their advice. I put stuff back in the closet again, put it away. And a number of years went by. I found the next thing. And the third time I took it, I said, I don't give a damn what anybody says. I'm going to follow this thing. I just can't let go of it. And I found all these fabulous, fabulous things that are just hiding in plain sight. But they're documented and they go back thousands of years about things about the Phoenicians, what they did with the Greeks, with the Romans, with the Egyptians, with all these other people. And it's just like sometimes, Eddie, we were talking earlier about something that just grabs you and makes you want to do something. And this was something that just got hold of me and wouldn't let go. So I just had to do it. And the book came out like 25 years after I started researching it. So things just happen sometimes.
Yeah, they do. And for a reason. I like how you're like, it's like it haunts you until you actually do something about it. This is an interesting question to me, and I'm not trying to fly into conspiracy theory stuff. I'm really not. But I do know for a fact that a lot of doctors, a lot of scientists today, and different climate monitors, et cetera, have big corporations in their back pockets. So they're paid to say a certain thing, whether it's true or not. So do you think in certain universities or certain corporations that are connected to researching history and things like that, why do you think the majority of them would just say there's no history there and then just sort of like turn you off to it? Is it because they're not thinking outside the box, or is it because they really believe what they were told by somebody else who didn't know what the hell they were talking about?
Perhaps a little of both.
Yeah.
But the thing that struck me most in talking to these professors was they were good people. I really enjoyed talking with them. They were knowledgeable and everything, but almost inevitably their degree and background was in Greek history or Roman history.
Oh.
And they want to talk about the Greeks and the Romans, and they really were not interested in anything else.
That's right.
And I love the fact that they're doing the research and finding these things, because the Greeks and the Romans were fascinating. But damn it, other people were fascinating too.
Yeah. I love that.
What did you ever had give a chance to go back and show your research to these professors?
I never made a point of going back to visit an individual professor because I didn't want to rub anybody's nose in the fact you
Look
told
what
me
I
this and
found.
here's this. I'm not a confrontational person.
Good for
I
you.
just love to show things to people and let them decide what they want to believe. And if somebody believes something else, hey,
Did they ever
good luck and keep going.
But did they ever contact you? Any of them?
They did not, but the nice thing that's happened after that was once the book was published, and if you do it the right way, I did strictly according to form. Over the many, many years, I've learned how to do the kind of research that will get you an academic publication. So I'd be invited to universities to give presentations. I would give technical papers with 7-page paper followed by 3 pages of footnotes. And it documented each and every source and each and everything. And I would be asked to present those at universities. And then I would get feedback from people who were hearing it fresh for the first time.
Wow.
And they were not on the spot to defend themselves. And then they said, oh, this is interesting. This is interesting. Somebody should look into this more. So it's like people respond well, but I think they have to do it at their own time and their own way. And that's okay, too.
Well, a lot of times on our show, we have, psychics, mediums. Do you ever feel, or do you ever maybe that you were a past life? I don't know if you believe in past lives, but do you believe that you might have been a past life from that area?
It's entirely possible. I mean, everyone's got their own views about past life and what that means, but I definitely do feel that each of us have things that go back before the time that we were actually born, somehow transmitted to us in some way. What it is, how it is, I'm not as certain or don't have as definite opinions as many people have, but I do feel there's definitely something there. Whether or not that contributed to why I have to do this, I have no idea, but it was just something I had to do.
Yeah, because when you said it kind of was haunting you, that it popped in my head. I wonder if you were actually of that time in that area. So,
Yeah, making sure that there was a, quote, history, meaning make sure that it gets out there and what their contribution was. What was one of the greatest contributions in their society that we probably don't know about that you found out?
There's a couple that we do know about, but some of the ones that people are not really familiar with is, for example, one thing that ties into the whole thing about Knights Templar and Freemasons is the thing about Solomon's Temple. Mm-hmm. They were the people who built Solomon's Temple for King Solomon. And that's maybe a strong way of putting it, but in fact, if you go back to those times, the Jewish people back then had been wandering from place to place, sort of nomadic existence. So they never really built cities. They kind of went from place to place as happened. Mm-hmm. They carried the Ark of the Covenant with them, and it was portable. And wherever they went, they would set it up in a tent and set up perimeter, and it would be a place of religious observance. But they never had a temple. So when it came time to build a temple, they had their next door neighbors, and there's a whole fascinating story about how they got on with the Phoenicians. But they arranged a good relationship with the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians built many temples for many years. The Phoenicians have been around for a long, long time at that point. We're talking 1,000 years BC. The Phoenicians have already been around for more than 1,000 years. And they'd built many temples in their cities at Sidon and Tyre and the other cities up and down the coast. So as part of that relationship then, they came and they agreed to help these other people, which in and of itself to me is a fascinating study because they worshiped their own gods back then.
Right.
Everyone was kind of doing what they could do. There was no Christianity. There was no things that we relate to, so they did the best they could, and they had their own beliefs. But here were these other people who had very strong beliefs about one God and everything that went with it, and yet they said, we'll help you build your temple. And so it worked out that King Solomon arranged to have the people come down from Tyre, and they sent King Hiram was the name of the king who was there, and they sent a mason whose name was also Hiram. They were no relation, but they both had the name Hiram. Wow. And that mason then was the master mason to build Solomon's temple. So they built it. In fact, there's a smaller temple in the city of Tyre that was used as sort of a prototype for the temple that was built in Jerusalem. And it was described by Herodotus, the Greek historian, called the father of history. And he had actually visited and seen that temple in 450 BC.
Wow.
So he described it, and it had 2 pillars in front. That particular temple in Tyre had 1 pillar of gold, one pillar of emerald. So it was a beautiful but small temple. they used that as a prototype and built a similar temple, which was Solomon's temple with 2 pillars in front, Jachin and Boaz, and much, much larger in scale, much grander. So it was this kind of thing that they did, which most people are not aware of, because you think, well, Phoenicians were sea traders. They wouldn't know about this kind of thing. But they were also master builders, and there's a whole history behind how they became master builders. But in fact, they had been building their own temples for an awful long time, practicing these arts, building the harbors their ships were in. And this is a contribution they made. And Solomon's temple is something, of course, that's echoed down through the ages. I mean, even today, there's not a person alive that doesn't know about Solomon's temple. You may not know much details about it, but you know it exists and it excites people. And particularly if you're Jewish, it still excites you. And if you're a Knights Templar, it excites you. If you're Mason, it excites you. It's like, it's still a very alive thing. And this is something the Phoenicians did. So if I had to say something that they did that people most don't often think about, I guess that comes to mind right away.
Well, so how old is, and again, Tony's expanding his fan base dramatically actually in the last 6 months, but we're on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other really great things, and we get wonderful guests like you. So there'll be some new people that are coming on board that are just hearing some of this for the very first time. So this might sound slightly off, and I hope it doesn't, but how old is religion, in your opinion?
Well, religion has always existed. There's never been a time there hasn't been religion. It just depends on what religion.
So that's what I got confused about. So when you were talking about the Jewish people were there, and then there was the Philologians, is that right? I'm saying it wrong. The Phoenicians, sorry.
I was like, theologians.
I'm like, what? The Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians worshiped their god, is that right? Or whatever their religion was.
They did. If you want to just touch on it briefly.
Yeah, so that I understand and so that the audience understands more clearly.
Okay, well, way back when, and we're talking several thousand years BC, all across Central Europe and a large part of the Near East, it was all an earth worship type of thing. It came from being farmers and having the seasons come and go. And so they became a mother goddess worship society.
Okay. Like Native Americans, et cetera, meaning even more primitive than that, then building up from there. Is that right?
Right. Well, at this time, we don't really know much about Native Americans several thousand years BC, but in terms of their history and beliefs, other than what we can find off drawings that are found in caves.
Yeah.
But certainly in Europe and the Near East, there was much more evidence because we actually find cult things, we find small temples, we find things that are left over from those times. But the key thing was they had a belief system where it was more of a, as I say, a goddess worship rather than a male-dominated, and the man in those religions was usually the consort of the woman. And in fact, in the first Phoenician city was in Byblos, and the goddess was called Balat Jebel, which is Our Lady of Jebal, Our Lady of Byblos. I should point out that many cities have 2 names.
Yeah.
The Phoenicians called it Jebal, and it was spelled with their letters GBL. But the Greeks came in and decided, okay, we get our books from here, we get our papyrus from here, so we're going to call it Byblos, which was their word for books.
Oh, wow.
Which
So
turned into Bible,
it's
right?
called Byblos in all of these things, and it's something that throws people off because many towns have 2 names in history, depending on who came when and what got written into the history books. So anyway, that goes back to those times. But they were very much a rustic believer of these kinds of deities back then, and the male god became more important to them as they became greater sea traders, so that the male god then would have his temple and the goddess would have her temple, and almost every Phoenician city had the 2 temples, one to the goddess, one to the god. She was more of a family goddess and land, and he was more of a sea god. And that was kind of the way it developed for them. But every different group had their own belief structure back then. The Phoenicians were very unusual in that they kept that lesser pressure existence of having a female deity rather than a strong macho male deity.
Right.
So they combined that with the fact that they were very small people, very limited in strength, and they found that in order to survive and trade, they had to be liked by people. They had no chance of conquering anybody. All of the people around them were bigger and stronger than they were. So they became a very peaceful people and experts at getting in and out of situations and in working with people rather than fighting people. So that's the example I used earlier, which happened time and time again in their history. And that's the thing I love about this. When you go back in and you find something that happens once, you say, well, maybe it happened, maybe it's a fluke. But when it happens over and over and over, then you say, okay, this was a characteristic of the society.
Right.
And in fact, that happened with the Phoenicians, that by the time King David came along and he was expanding Israel, he was conquering in all directions. We know about him and Goliath and the stone fighting.
That's so funny.
That whole thing. But he was, with all those battles, he was going north with the idea that he would have to conquer the Phoenicians, and they sent a party out to meet him and said, we don't have to fight. We've got these great gifts for you. You can wonderful things you're going to love. And so he accepted the gifts and the pledge of peace, and he never fought the Phoenicians. They were friends from that point forward, so that when his son came in need, he had a friend who could help him. And that was a much better way to develop history.
Which is funny because they're a peaceful community, therefore there's no history. But if they were warmongers, they would probably be a history in the books about them.
Yes, and maybe not. I don't know. It's hard to say, because a trait that they had, and it may have come from this peacefulness, but in order to survive, the other thing they had to do besides not fighting people was they had to be secretive. They had to tell people, nobody, about what they were doing. They wouldn't tell anybody where their sea routes were. They wouldn't tell anybody what kind of money they had, any kind of wealth they had, any information they had. They were visiting every society in the Mediterranean, and they passed along some of the things when it helped business, but they mostly did not commit to anybody else what they knew. One of the things that I thought about earlier when you asked what did they contribute, something almost everybody knows is that they had the first alphabet. They brought to the Greeks the alphabet at a time when the Greeks did not have an alphabet.
That's wild.
The Greeks had gone into their dark age, and they had no literacy. The Phoenicians arrived with their sea trade and brought the Phoenician alphabet. The Greeks took that alphabet and modified it because the Phoenicians just used consonants. They didn't use any vowels. So the Greeks said, I got a good idea. We'll change some of the letters. We'll redesignate this round thing and call it an O, and that'll be a vowel. So they had vowels mixed in with the consonants, and that's how the Greek alphabet developed directly from the Phoenician. And it's something that if you ask people point blank, they will say, oh, yes, that's true. Among historians, among linguists, there's no question. Linguists come right out and say, every alphabet, the Russian alphabet, the Arabic alphabet, all these alphabets come from the Phoenician alphabet, because that was what was essentially the lingua franca. That everybody had the Phoenician alphabet. That's what you learned from. So that was, I'm sorry, I assumed everybody knew that. So
Lord, no, everybody doesn't.
I'm from Kansas. So.
I'm from North Carolina. We still don't talk pretty there. But what I think is hysterical, I bet it would be great if Vanna White went to Ancestry.com, did the DNA test, and then found out that every time she turns a vowel, that her ancestors are actually Phoenician.
All right. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just about a minute break. When we come back, we're going to get into the
Knights of Templar,
because what we were talking about is, and I believe that the Knights Templar was didn't they protect, or I don't know, I'm not even going to get it because you know the truth. So but more the Mary Magdalene. Is that right? Is that just another Hollywood myth?
That's a thing that existed, but it's a Hollywood thing in terms of how it developed, and you see it in movies and projected to most people. But there's many, many fascinating stories we can get into.
Yeah, we're going to find out more. So this is Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
And we're going to be right back. This is our sponsor, Heaven's Harvest. Make sure you get your seeds and plant them and protect your family. So here we go. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Agri-terrorism in the USA? Is it possible? Makes you wonder, could it be possible for our food to be poisoned? How will the public know which foods have been contaminated with toxins before it's too late? Heaven's Harvest wants to help you become independent of these rare but possible scenarios. Protect your future and become self-reliant with heirloom seeds. Grow your own garden. From urban to rural living, Heaven's Harvest seeds are the answer to any type of scenario. Go to truthbetoldseeds.com and order your bucket today. Every type of vegetable you could imagine. Go to truthbetoldseeds.com or call 1-800-516-4773. When you go to truthbetoldseeds.com and purchase your bucket, you will get 5% off the original price. So order today at truthbetoldseeds.com.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Eddie Connor.
And I'm Tony Sweet.
And we're here with our guest, author, and historian, Sanford Holst. Am I saying that right, Sanford?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. Now, I know before we went to the break, Tony wanted to ask you about the Knights of Templar, and we want to get into some of the nitty-gritty with that.
So, yeah, because it was part of, well, at the beginning of Christianity, I believe, I could be wrong. Could you tell us exactly where the Knights Templar become part of our history?
Okay, sure. As a matter of fact, there's things that are known and things that are not known, so we can cover both of them.
Oh, good. I love that.
The things that are known, the basics, are that Christianity really got its boost up when all of the different bits and pieces left after Christ was in Israel and in Jerusalem.
Right.
That there were many, many, many different stories. They all got pulled together about 300 A.D. by the Roman emperor, who himself converted to Christianity on his deathbed. His mother had been Christian long before that. And that then became the official religion of Rome. And they had to go through their own throes and growth pains. But eventually the bishop of Rome became the pope and became the senior bishop of all the bishops.
Right.
And that was still developing when the whole thing about the Crusades came up. And the Crusades started right around the year 1100 A.D.
Wow.
So at that point, there's a whole lot of buildup in terms of how the Crusades came about, but we don't need to go into all of that stuff yet.
Right.
Let's just say that it happened. But then the Crusade formed, and people went all the way over to the Holy Land, and they, in fact, did conquer Jerusalem, and that was in 1099 when they actually reached the walls and were in Jerusalem and actually were able to establish Christianity there in the holy city itself. So that was well and good and exciting, but there were many people there who wanted to go home right away. So as soon as the city was taken, most of them packed up and left. A few knights stayed to protect the people who are now coming from all over Europe who had not been able to come before. They were now coming as pilgrims, and a few knights stayed. And one of them, Hugh de Payens, brought together 8 other knights with him, and they formed the Knights Templar to protect the people who were coming there.
And what was his name again?
Hugh de Payens. And he had an interesting story, too, because most people feel that this was everything there is to know about the beginning of the Knights Templar, that Hugh de Payens started this, and he became the first Grand Master. The other 7 voted for him, so he was it. Mm-hmm. And he then was followed by other Grand Masters. Everybody says, okay, that's how the Knights Templar started, but they're missing out on a huge part of the story, because there was another fellow who was also instrumental in forming the Knights Templar, and that's Hugh de Champagne. Mm. And most people have never heard of Hugh, the Count of Champagne. Mm. But Champagne was one of the largest provinces of France, and Hugh de Payens was the lord of a small little town called Payens in Champagne, and he was about 7 miles away from the capital of Champagne. And when Hugh de Payens was 23 years old, a young man became his lord as Count of Champagne, and that was Hugh, Count of Champagne, who at that time was 19 years old. So these 2 men named Hughes became good friends. And in fact, when Hugh de Payens went off to war, they wouldn't let the Count of Champagne go. He and the king and other people were told, you're too valuable, you can't go, you get killed, we have problems with succession and everything else, so you have to stay. So he watched his friend go off to war. The wars were fought, but then after the city of Jerusalem was taken and things were established, things were settling down a bit, and the Count of Champagne was able to go visit his friend in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem. And this was about the year 1114. So while he was there, the Count of Champagne, who again is like number 2 behind the King of France, a very powerful person, decided he really wanted to see something happen more in terms of monastic religious beliefs. So he gave a gift of land to a man named Bernard as a monk to start an abbey at a place called Clairvaux. This Bernard became Saint Bernard, whom everybody's heard about. So he gave the land to Bernard to start his abbey, and Bernard started his abbey, a Cistercian abbey, which had white robes, and they started their abbey, and this was in 1115 that happened. So then, 4 years later, lo and behold, Hugh de Payens starts the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar is a brotherhood that wants to become an order, but was not yet an order. And they had white robes, and they were financed by his good friend. So they actually were getting started that way. The Count of Champagne came back, and the Knights Templar were starting to struggle, and nothing was really happening. So he went back to the Holy Land and visited his friend again. And this time he stayed. In 1125, the Count of Champagne gave up his county and became a Knights Templar. And he put his hands in the hands of his childhood friend and became a Templar serving the Grand Master, who had been the person who used to serve him. That brought a powerful force into the Knights Templar. A few years after that, then, in order to actually become a real order, they had to get the Pope's blessing, because at this point it was a few knights running around in Jerusalem, and they had no blessing from the Pope. So they started a whole campaign. And most people say, and it's fortunate that they asked, so-and-so to intervene, and somehow St. Bernard got involved, and somehow things happened. Anyone who's heard those facts can conclude, how did St. Bernard get involved in this whole thing? St. Bernard had already sent a letter when he got his abbey to the Count of Champagne, thanking him profusely and said, if there's anything I can ever do for you. And clearly, the reason why St. Bernard picked up the cause of Hugh de Payens and the Knights Templar was because he owed everything he had to the Count of Champagne. Mm-hmm. So he then interceded for them. He arranged for the Pope to receive Hugh de Payens. He arranged for the council to approve it. He wrote the rule for the Order of the Knights Templar, and they created the official order and created them as an order that reported directly to the Pope and had all the prestige and power and influence that would go with that. And that's how the Knights Templar got off and running and became a large and successful organization. And it's because of Hugh de Payens, but also because of Hugh, Count of Champagne. It's two friends, both named Hugh, who were lifelong friends, that made this whole thing happen. And it's a story most people don't hear.
I've never heard that. That's why I'm like just staring at you like, this is interesting stuff. Yeah. I showed a picture, actually. I found it on the internet. I hope it's okay. But it's fascinating to me to see how they created something so, at the time, small, that grew into such a powerful organization. And spread and still around today. And you really don't get to hear about that so much anymore, but it's still a strong organization. So what was their belief? Were they Christians, or what, or were they, what was, because that's,
what was the predominant religion?
Yeah.
Okay, in those days, if you were Christian, you were Catholic. There was no second choice.
What is it when you're lion food?
You're Christians.
Those are Christians.
Okay.
Yeah, they were all Catholics. But everybody was Catholic until the Protestant Reformation.
What were they before that?
Everybody's Catholic.
Before that?
Well, it was, Christianity was what everybody called themselves after Jesus gave all of his teachings to the disciples, and the disciples went out to teach that.
Right.
They were all teaching Christianity. But when it all got pulled together and was under the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, that's when it became called the Catholic. And Catholic just means all-inclusive. It's the all-inclusive church. So the Catholic Church was Christianity. It was like when they pulled it all together and wrote, most people don't realize the Bible was not actually written until the 300 A.D.
Well, I knew that. I did know that.
Right, when Constantine called them all together, and then they formed the actual wording, decided what to put in, what to leave out. So they actually had a single belief with a single book, and that was Christianity, and that was the Catholic Church. And there was no other church.
Which means all-inclusive. It meant all-inclusive then, but it doesn't seem to feel like it's all-inclusive now.
It absolutely has changed dramatically.
Yeah.
And that's again, related to the thing we're talking about today, but it gets in there many, many years later. The Protestant Reformation didn't really get happening until like the 1500s AD. But in all the years before that, there would be an occasional objecting group, but not formal religions per se.
And in the beginning, was there a little bit more of the, as you helped us understand earlier, there's a little bit of that feminine power and masculine power. Seems like there was a nice little combination of that. And now as we're moving forward and we're finding out more about this, it looks like they're inching out the feminine and really going toward the masculine.
Right. That actually started happening a long, long time ago.
Yeah, like 2,000 years ago, and we're not doing very good with that.
We're not doing very good with that at all, but there's a lot of things we can learn from things that happened in the past, obviously.
So what is the biggest misconception about Freemasonry? What's the biggest misconception? Because a lot of people will hear about it, and so here's the kinds of stuff that people were emailing me. Is Jay-Z a Freemason? Is Beyonce a Freemason?
They're saying that they're Illuminatis.
Right. Well, I mean, the Illuminatis, but then the other people in power and politics and behind Koch brothers and different things like that. I mean, these are extremists.
Right.
That I'm talking about. But that had said the thing, they're like, ask him. And so what is the biggest misconception, in your opinion, about Freemasonry? The biggest misconception?
I would say the single biggest misconception you keep running across over and over for absolutely no reason understandable at all is that Freemasonry somehow is a religion. It's absolutely not a religion. The fundamental thing about being a Mason is you have to believe in God.
Doesn't mean you have to believe in...
But
you don't have to believe in
the same God.
The same God as ever. You just have
absolutely
to believe.
Not. And in fact, it's fundamental that if you believe in God, and after that no questions are asked, then you could be Jewish, Christian, Muslim. You can be whatever you want. If you believe in God, you can be a Freemason. And in fact, there are people of every religion are members of Freemasonry.
Yeah.
And many people who are in other religions are used to the fact that everybody who's different than me must be some other religion. And that's not necessarily true.
Right.
This is like a gathering basket of people who are not only tolerant is actually not a terribly good word. Everybody uses, I'm tolerant of other religions. It's not really a very good thing. To be tolerant means I hate you, but I'm not going to kill you. That's tolerant. Right. That's what tolerant means. And that's not a very good thing.
Yeah, well.
Now, these are people who actually like people of other religions and would like to have conversations with them.
Because you can learn if you listen.
Exactly. And so many of these things are interrelated. The Jews were well established before the Christians. The Tanakh, the writings of the Jewish people became the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. There's so many things that are interrelated that we don't even stop to think about it. But in Freemasonry, you find people of all religions.
So Freemasons are not a religion.
Absolutely not.
If you're part of it, if you're involved in it, you must believe in God in whatever your belief about the divine is.
Exactly.
And what's something that we've heard? What's a common thing we thought was a misconception but is real?
That you thought was a misconception, but is real.
Like JC and Beyonce are Illuminatis, and then they're secret Freemasons who are
Could
taking over the world.
Could you explain that Illuminati and Freemasonry are completely different?
And a lot of people think that they're connected.
Completely different. Illuminati is a word for strange people doing strange things in private, and we don't know who they are.
Well, that could be gay people.
Yeah.
You're an Illuminati!
It could be anything. So, in fact, that's kind of a universal word of which there is no membership in Illuminati. You don't go to a meeting and they don't give you a membership card. If you're a Mason, you have been accepted into a lodge. You have been given a membership. You are a recognized member of Freemasonry. So Freemasonry is an actual group. Illuminati is kind of a catch-all that.
Kind of like some of the outcasts in society, as it were.
Well, before we go, before we get off topic, because I want to go back a little bit, because I want to find out with the Knights Templar,
Yeah.
how we move forward. When Protestants started becoming into the scene, it's not a religion, but did they like choose sides?
That's a very good question. To get there, we have to go through several steps first.
Well, let's
So
try it.
If you don't mind,
no. Let's do whatever you want to do.
Okay, let's do a couple of steps and a couple of stories first before we get there.
Okay.
Some of the things were very fundamental about the Knights Templar. They were a very strange group. They had things that did not really happen back then. They had banking, for example, at a time when religious groups took orders of poverty, and not a one of them would know anything about business whatsoever. So how did they get involved in that and the other things that they were doing? It kind of gets back to something that happened in the Knights Templar early on, and maybe it picks up from the story early about how they got formed, but at the time when they were just getting started and everybody left to go back to Europe, to go back to their families, the Knights were there, they had no support. Most people don't realize that in the Knights Templar and in other kinds of orders, the actual Knights were supported by about 7 supporters for each one Knight. So they made up a minority of the group were Knights. The rest were all brothers, but they were performing serving roles. There was like the foot soldier who stood beside him. There was a person who took care of his horse. There was a person who got the food to feed all of them. There were all these things that were going on. So there was a definite need for them to have serving men in the group. They could recruit Knights easily, but every time you got one Knight, you had to go out and find 7 different supporting men. So you couldn't afford to bring them in from Europe. What they found was that in the Holy Land, where they were, the people who had been Phoenician at one time, who lived in Lebanon, were now called the Lebanese people. And the Lebanese people had all converted to Christianity about 400 A.D. This is another thing that almost nobody realizes, but it's an actually totally documented.
They just picked Christianity.
Well, Christianity got its start in the neighborhood, and there were priests, particularly a fellow called Maron, who started the Maronite Christians. You may have heard the name occasionally used with respect to Lebanon. And he and a couple people like himself made pilgrimages all over Lebanon, and they converted everyone because everyone liked this religion of love, the way it was presented to them.
Oh, the way it was then, not now.
It was presented as a religion of love, as love your brother, love your fellow man. And they said this fits right in with our
Philosophy.
as you say, the previously oriented towards the goddess philosophy, the peaceful philosophy.
Yeah.
So they took it like a duck to water, and literally the entire country converted to Christianity.
Well, I would have too then.
Yeah. So it was a great thing that happened, and this was about 400 A.D. Then in the 600s A.D., Muhammad got his start, and there was a Muslim conquest that came through the area that conquered Jerusalem, but also swept on up and conquered Lebanon as well. And the country divided. So about half of the country was still Christian, mostly in the mountains, and the Muslims had the big cities. So the country was half Christian, half Muslim. Then in 1100 A.D., when the Crusaders came in, they found a country that 50% of the people in the country were all Christians. And they had people there to help them and supply them and take care of them. So when they needed supporters, they had all these local Lebanese Christians. They could hire them locally. Every time they got a night, they just go up the road to Tyre or Sidon or one of the Lebanese cities and pick up 7 more people. These were people who were well educated. That was another trait of the Phoenicians, which came into the Lebanese people. They were all well educated. They were very good at business, as the Phoenicians had been. And they were also good at masonry, as the early Phoenicians had been. So they had people to build the walls of their fortifications. They had people to take care of their supplying. They all spoke the local language. They were good businessmen. They could take care of everything. So they started hiring more and more of these local people to be their supporters for all the Knights. As time went on, they developed 3 different levels in the Knights Templar. There was the Knights themselves, who wore the white robes, the serving men, who wore brown robes or black robes with the red cross on it. And then there was a third group, which were the clerical people, who actually would take care of the religious part of the needs of all the people, but also the administrative needs of all of the brothers in the temple. So the clerical people had green robes that distinguished them, and they were the literate people who could take care of all these things. A lot of people don't realize, if I digress for just one little sidebar, a lot of people don't realize that back then, in the 1100s, 1200s time period, almost everybody was illiterate. Almost everybody. The knights were illiterate. The kings were illiterate. The most they could do with most of them was that they would be taught how to sign their name and recognize the alphabet. And that was it. For anything that happened, they brought in a cleric, which is how we got the word clerical. Wow. Someone who can write, someone who knows how to put this thing on paper. So the king would call in a cleric, a religious person, who then could write down what was happening in court and write the letter they send to the other king. The other king would get his cleric to read the letter to him. So that was how things happened back then. The Knights Templar had their clerics in these green robes they picked up locally from Lebanon, who knew how to write and who also were familiar with many languages, who understood business and everything else. So this was a substantial part of what happened to the Knights Templar. Yeah. You're talking about how did they grow and become influential. Their whole banking system came out of the fact that they had these people who indigenously were great businessmen who knew about all these things, who had been bankers of their own for many hundreds of years. And they could set up a banking system then that was fairly new to Europe, but the Knights Templar were able to set up something that other people didn't have. And it's because they acquired these local Lebanese Christians who could become their support group and help them make all these things happen.
Were the Lebanese Christians as secretive as the Phoenicians were, just out of curiosity?
In fact, they were, yes.
So, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. You will not learn how to add and subtract, but I got your money.
Exactly. And that's another interesting thing, too, that the Knights Templar started being differentiated from all of the other brotherhoods. There were many other orders at that time. There were Dominicans, Cistercians, all these other groups. And the Knights Templar were different because of secrecy, for one thing, that you just mentioned. Yeah. And in fact, later, when they were put on trial and we were accused of many things, one of the things they were accused of was their secrecy. They said, why are you, of all the orders, so secretive? You do all these things in private. Therefore, what you're doing must be bad because you're doing it in private.
And what was the answer?
Their answer was, well, we do what we do because this is what we do.
Yeah, but what's the real answer? I mean, I get that they do what they do because it's what they do, but was there ever never an answer?
Well,
about the secrecy?
Okay, the things get answered to a degree.
Right.
And we're skipping ahead a little bit, but the trials that they're put into after 1307, when they were accused by the King of France and by the Pope,
who was probably illiterate, right?
The King of France was basically illiterate. The Pope was very literate.
Yeah.
But they were accused of many different things for their own reasons, but the secrecy broke then. The reason why we know so much about the Knights Templar and all their internal dealings was it had all been kept very, very secret up to that point. But the Pope was the commander of the Knights Templar. And when he joined King Philip in prosecuting his own people, he ordered them to tell the truth, to tell what they had been keeping secret. And so the Knights would tell part of the story. They wouldn't tell the whole story. And it was only by the many different trials that were held that they eventually accumulated enough information they could find out what was actually happening. But one of the great things that happened with this whole unfortunate circumstance about Knights Templar being put on trial was that there were clerics present at every trial, and they wrote everything down. So we've got fabulous records, and I've been through all kinds of these things from the 1300s and earlier,
amazing.
Where you get actual verbatim transcripts of what happened. Well, verbatim meaning somebody was sitting there digested it, but then he wrote that same day what happened that day in the trial. So it was that kind of thing that you could go back to. And today you can learn so much from those things about what was happening and the Knights Templar. That's how we find out about them.
That's the first. I remember the first time I heard this phrase: the one with the most knowledge always wins.
Yeah.
And I wondered where that originated from. And I have a feeling, Sanford, it originated here. I really do, because think about it. I mean, the Pope had more knowledge than the actual king even.
Yeah.
So they really never divulged all of their secrets, as it were. It's more like a little puzzle, and that's sort of like Sudoku.
Exactly.
And they had to piece it together. That is phenomenal. But weren't they like killed or murdered or something for not telling the secrets?
No, it was a slightly different thing. The Crusades eventually wound down.
Yeah.
and the Crusaders were expelled from the Holy Land. I believe it was 1291 when they left the city of Acre, which was basically the last base. They went to Cyprus.
Okay.
And at that time, there were the Knights Hospitaller, which was a similar but competing group, and the Knights Templar, and they both went to Cyprus. But the Pope had been thinking for some time about, well, we have no more Crusades. We're not in the Holy Land. Why do I have two military orders who are both supported by, all the money that people are donating? Why don't I just have one order? He liked the idea. The other two orders didn't particularly like the idea. But so he was thinking about this at the time when King Philip saw an awful lot of wealth in the Knights Templar and thought at the time he was desperate. He'd been spending money like it was water. He had no sense of finances. He needed money. And an unfortunate thing happened that he had to take refuge from his own people because of dumb things that he'd done with money. And he took refuge with the Knights Templar in Paris. And while he was in Paris, in the stronghold, he saw all the money that was piled up in there. It turns out it was not Knights Templar money. They were holding the money for other people. But he saw all this wealth, and he had these dreams about he's going to get really wealthy if he just get rid of these Knights Templar.
So if he gets rid of them.
If he gets rid of them, he can take all of the stuff. He can say, all the property in France that belonged to them is now mine.
Was he a Christian?
Well, yeah.
Just curious.
Yeah. The whole thing devolved down to personal greed by the King of France.
Yeah.
But the King of France had essentially appointed the Pope. There's a whole story behind that, which would take a lot of going into, but several different popes were opposing the King of France, and they died mysteriously. Let's just put it that way. So his chosen fellow, a Frenchman, was named Pope after that, and he lived, as long as he made sure the King of France was happy. That was Clement V. So when Philip decided he was going to knock off the Knights Templar, Clement V played along with it, unfortunately, and he essentially betrayed his own people.
And hence the political system was born.
Yeah, I guess. I guess. Reminds you of political systems everywhere.
It does.
But unfortunately, that is what happened. So that's why they were attacked. It was not for belief. It was not for right or wrong. But of course, once you accuse somebody, you have to find reasons.
Of course.
Why did I accuse you? Now I have to find a reason why I accused you. Therefore, and they started going to people and saying, would you tell me something about the Knights Templar I can believe? And I said, okay, well, they're secretive, and okay, they've got, they do this and that. They worship dogs or whatever. I don't know. They're making up things left and right.
Lots of money.
And so all of these trials were accusing them of all these different things. And one thing led to another, but that's essentially why they were put on trial. And then those that were convicted of heresy were burned at the stake.
Well,
so they literally were burned while alive.
Oh, see, that just freaks me out. So the Knights of Templar had, whenever the king was seeking refuge there, then that's when he saw all the money and his imagination went wild with him and that sort of thing. That was the banking system. There weren't banks outside of that. That was literally the start of the banking system.
That's
Is that
right.
Right. So and they were literally holding other people's money, and then he just thought that they were secretly raping and pillaging people's money.
Right.
I guess.
Right. And all of that was involved in it. But one of the other misconceptions people have is the whole thing about, well, then I guess all the Knights Templar were arrested and killed then in 1307. And it's amazing how many people believe that because that's pushed around so much.
Yeah.
In fact, there were about 4,000 brothers in the Knights Templar at the time all this came down in 1307. But of that number, and I went through all these wonderful, meticulous records that wrote down exactly who was put on trial, where and when and for what. I could find only about 500 people that were ever arrested and put on trial. And many of them were able to confess and be turned loose, but hundreds of them were actually killed and burned at the stake. But out of 4,000, if 500 of them were arrested, that means 3,500 were not arrested. Where did they go?
And did they live?
Did they move east to England?
Actually, there were many small things that happened. There were people migrating from place to place, but eventually they all had to run for cover because England was a few months behind France, but eventually the Pope put pressure on the King of England to follow the example of the King of France and to declare that they were outlaws and to arrest them and put them on trial and kill them. So that was something that followed up. So yes, some of them ran north, but eventually they had to go to ground because eventually the Pope covered all of the spaces they could run to. So some very fascinating things happened there, but this is, again, something that ties into something people don't know. In the banking system that they had back then that they set up, they had to protect all this money that happened. They had what I call like a river of gold that they set up. The Knights Templar were given by generous benefactors over the course of 200 years. They were given 870 estates. And these were in all different countries, in France, England, Scotland, Poland, Spain, everywhere.
Just given.
They were just given, donated to them for the good of one's soul, etc. You know, if you were a king, if you were a count or something, you could give this. This would get you grace with God, etc. It was a common belief back then, and it was not discouraged.
For no exchange back?
No exchange back. Well, the exchange was grace, and you could go to heaven. But
I believe you. I'm just sitting there going, yeah, something feels funny about that to me. I'm not that what you're saying, but there were no politics.
Well, the things that were going on back then, you have to understand, in the Crusades, that was the biggest thing happening. Right. Everybody was a member of the same religion. There was only one religion. If you were Christian, you were Catholic.
What happened to the Muslims? Because
an entirely separate story. But
okay.
But we could digress, go into that, but then we kind of lose the whole trail of all the rest.
Well,
of
let's not lose the trail. But I'm
You'll
just like,
have to come back
because we went to Jews, Muslims, Christians, and now it's only Christians. I'm so confused because I'm not knowledgeable about it.
Well, I'm saying in Europe.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry.
In Europe. In Europe. So if you were king
Thank
of
you.
France, if you were king of Germany, if you were king of any place, king of Spain, you were Catholic.
Okay.
It just was the way it was.
And now I can see why, and I may be wrong, but I can see why now when you say a Freemason, and I want to get into how Knights Templar turned into.
We're getting very close.
but I can see now why, just as one of the requirements is believing in God, because of that doesn't have to be Christian. I can see now why they don't just say you need to be Christian, because they were done wrong.
Yeah, exactly. You put your finger exactly on it. That's amazingly perceptive, because most people don't make that connection, but you got it exactly.
Ding, ding, ding.
So let me tell you how that happened.
Yeah.
Please do.
Okay. So at this point, as the Knights Templar were in the 1300s and just about to be attacked, they had this banking system everywhere that was drawing off all of the resources they were gathering from all these 870 estates. And this river of gold was flowing to the east. It was going to Jerusalem, the Holy Land. They had to pay for knights, they had to pay for horses, they had to pay for supporting men, they had to pay for battles, they had to pay for everything they were doing. So every time they got some money, they would send it east. But they needed all of their fighting men in the Holy Land, particularly after they'd suffered so many losses. They had very few fighting men, and they needed every available soldier to be in the east. So what happened was they then had to resort to secrecy. Instead of having a caravan of knights escorting the gold from one place to another, they set up a series of safe houses where they could then convert the money from all the different farms. They could bring it into a local gathering place, and from there move it to another safe house in the city and move it from there to the next city. And all of this money was flowing, and nobody knew where it was or when it was. For example, the King of France had no clue how much money they had, where it was flowing, what was happening. It was all done completely in secret. That's one of the reasons for the secrecy.
Yeah.
Was they had their whole money flow happening, so it was in public view. You could see the building, but nobody knew that was a safe house that was being used by the Knights Templar. They were able to do that because they would acquire a piece of property, which is public record, and they found an amazing thing. After the Knights Templar were gone, they had to go through, sort out all the records. These properties were sold, resold many different times, and a lot of them just disappeared. So they had all of these properties that nobody knew who owned this property. And this was the safe houses they had set up. And these were scattered all across Europe, where they kept their money and it controlled all of their finances. So when they were attacked, they had all these safe houses that were available all across Europe as places people could go to that nobody had any clue that the Knights Templar owned these places. They were not going to go look for Knights Templar there. And they didn't have to run to England or to some other place. You just go to the safe house and you stayed there. You closed the door and nobody could find you. So it was a place that they had their own local lodging that they could live and survive. That ties into another thing, though. A lot of people don't realize that in order to be a knight in those days, you had to be a noble. You had to be from a noble family.
Yeah.
So they had all of these knights from noble families in England, France, Spain, etc. And then suddenly the Knights Templar were being attacked. And some of the Knights Templar were being burned alive. And if somebody heard that their son had escaped and was in hiding, they would take care of their son. So gradually all of these people moved from their safe houses they were set up in another small estate. Maybe they had to change their name. They could get married.
Right.
They could have kids. But all these noble families were taking care of their sons to get them out of the safe house into a safe place. But they had all taken a lifelong oath to their other brothers. They were brothers for the rest of their life, Templar or not. So they would get together with their other brothers, but they needed a place to meet. So they would go back to the lodgings that they had when they were in the safe houses, and they would meet there.
In smaller groups?
In as many people as could fit into the lodging house. So
Yeah,
each
okay.
one was a small group, yes, maybe 20, 30 people.
Okay.
So here were these rich and powerful men forced to live in secret who would go to their lodge and meet in secret. And a secret society formed, and they had to pick a name for it. So they picked a
here we
name.
go.
So they had to pick a name that was not Knights Templar because everybody would know it was them. They picked the name that went back to their roots of these people they'd gotten from the Lebanese Christians who were Masons, and they called themselves Masons.
Wow.
And it all started from there. The thing that surprises most people, and again, the things I'm telling you, most Freemasons do not know all of these facts.
Really?
When I present it to them, they're like flabbergasted. And yet, I can say something to them that I can't say to you. I can say, well, go back in your ritual then and look at your ritual and see if any of this resonates. And they go back and say, well, this part here, that fits to the story. And this ritual where we say this fits. And this thing that we do, that fits.
Yeah.
So it's like all these things that came out of the Knights Templar experience being forced into hiding fits right into Masonry today. One of a small example, every lodge, and I can say this because everybody knows it, every lodge is guarded by a Tyler. And the Tyler is just a position these days, the person
Right.
who controls the door. His badge of office is a drawn sword. The Knights Templar, when they met in secret, would always leave one knight at the door with a drawn sword. And that was how they conducted their secret meetings. And the drawn sword was not symbolic. It was not a thing he wore. It was a thing in his hand. And if anybody came to break into a Knights Templar meeting, they could kill the person and drive them off because they had to have their secrecy. They had
Right.
to preserve the things that they were
That
doing.
makes sense.
So many of these different things you see in Freemasonry, what is done, and you look back at the Knights Templar and you say, I had no clue that was a tie-in. So all of these things, it's eye-opening. But the thing you're saying about religion comes directly into this experience also. You can imagine, here you are in a safe house, your brothers down the street have been arrested, some of them have been burned to death in public, and you're sitting in this safe house, and the person that's doing this was your Pope. The person you were serving, you're dedicated your whole life. Some of your brothers had died in the Holy Land in order to serve the Pope and serve the Catholic Church, and this is what was happening to you. There was, from all indications, there was a divide among the brothers that some of them lost their faith and lost their belief, and it would have nothing to do with the Catholic Church, and others still believed in God, still believed in the Church. They just didn't believe in what the Pope had done to them. So there was a divide among the brothers, and their agreement was, okay, but we're still brothers, so we will not talk about that. You have your religion, I have my religion, you have your beliefs, you like the Pope, you don't like the Pope, whatever it may be, but we're not going to talk about that. That is, even today, still a requirement in Freemasonry. Everybody has to believe in God, but you do not discuss religion or politics.
That makes sense.
That's the best way to do it because A, it's really nobody's business, and B, it's something sacred to you. You have those belief systems for a reason, and I like your philosophy in that I love talking to people of all nationalities and cultures and religions. I do because it's how we're supposed to, I believe, learn. And this philosophy sets the stage for that. But inside of the temple or the Freemason world, I think it's smart not to talk about those aspects because it is it's a divisive dividing device. And I think it's deliberately that in a lot of ways. And this keeps them intact and whole as a community.
It definitely does. And by the way, the interpretation that's used on that is that people can mention the fact, yes, they are Jewish or something, or they are a Christian, or they have a certain belief, but you can't solicit any brother for any religion. You can't argue over any religion. You can't say this is better because of that. You totally accept what the other brother says and does.
I do too. And I'm wondering if some of the reason for that today is because it goes back to when they were sending people out in different parts of the world to convert them to Christianity, and then stuff started to backfire later. Meaning that's when people started to like, Muslim, Christian, Jew, my religion's stronger than yours. There's only one God. My God's right. You're wrong.
There have been several books written on that subject that says perhaps the strength of those religions was what caused a lot of the fighting that's gone on.
Oh, yeah, because almost every war we've ever had has something to do with religion pretty much, right?
Well, most lives lost were during the Crusades and on this planet. So because of religion,
which was grounded initially in love. Love thy neighbor. Love people, treat people the way you want to be treated. How did we get so far from that? And how do the Freemasons stay in that?
Well, the Freemasons may have lucked out by virtue of this horrific experience.
Yeah.
As the Knights Templars, seeing their brothers killed and having their faith shaken by the fact that it was not just a king that was doing this, but the head of their own church that was doing it. It shook them to the core, and they had to deal with it. So they had to come up with a way to live with themselves and live with their world, and this was it. They found this way of living with their brothers, respecting their brothers. If you believe that, it's okay, but you're still my brother. I still love you as a brother, but you can believe what you want to believe.
And I've got your back. And we're a community.
Exactly.
We're a secret community because that's the only way we're going to live through this.
Yeah.
Exactly. They were outlaws.
Yeah.
They were literally outlaws, and they had to protect each other because they were still making arrests. People were still being picked up. They had to, if any brother was in need, the other brother had to come to his aid. And again, that's something in Freemasonry to this day.
You don't see that anymore.
Why do you think? Because I'm listening to all this, amazing story that you're telling that's true, but how did they not just say, F it?
Some of them did.
I know, but to keep getting stronger and more...
drop into their faith.
Yeah, because if you think about it, when they came to America and our founding fathers, many were Freemasons, was coming to America the first time that they really had the political power, where in England and Europe at that time, or maybe they already had it in Europe, but did they have the power in the political system for the first time when they came to this country, or no?
That's very hard to say because Freemasonry was a secret society up until 1717.
So that's, yeah.
And that's also a thing that many Masons will kind of have difficulty saying as well. It's a strange thing, but people are very emphatic about the fact that today it is not a secret society, and that's absolutely true. Freemasonry is not a secret society. You go down the street, you see a lodge building, it says on the outside of it, Masons. It's like got a number on it. The square and compass is right there. Everybody
like
knows
a VFW.
it's a masonry place, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a secret society anymore. It's what they call nowadays society with secrets, which means there's some things still done in ritual you can't talk about. But okay,
Right.
Everybody knows it exists. Everybody knows who Masons are. People wear lapel pins, etc. So it's very much open and it's out there. But the response to that is a lot of people are very reluctant to say that it ever was a secret society. They don't want to talk about it. And it's unfortunate because your heritage is your heritage is your heritage.
I
It's
love
just
heritage.
what is.
That's
History.
Yeah.
And in fact, everybody knows, every Mason can tell you side by side with that, the year 1717, and that was the year that 4 lodges came out into public and created the first Grand Lodge in public. It was in London.
Oh, really?
And it's all documented, what they were doing, where they were doing it. And the Grand Lodge of England was formed then and has progressed from then. The more Grand Lodges have been set up. So it came out into the public then, and there's many reasons for that, but it eventually got to the point where they could actually survive without having to be secret. And it gets back to this thing we were talking about before. There's many details in it, but just in the broad brush, the fact that people needed to be protected from their kings and the religious leaders was a huge factor in Freemasonry getting started, as you saw with the Knights Templar. As things evolved, and again, there's a whole long history of what evolved and how it evolved, but the church eventually lost its power to kill people. And the kings eventually lost their power to kill people. The ways that was done very traditionally through so many years was all the king had to do was say treason, send somebody out to be executed, period. All the head of the Catholic Church had to do was accuse somebody of heresy, run him out and burn him. So it was all, for many, many years they had that power. Once that power was broken, particularly with the Bill of Rights in England, when that was passed because of the religious splits and the fight over the kings, when the whole change took place with William and Mary coming in, they forced William and Mary to sign a Bill of Rights for the people so that the king could not be so absolute over them anymore. That was a huge change that limited the power of the kings. So with the church and the king no longer able to arrest somebody without warrant, to take them out and kill them, there was no need for the secrecy to protect brothers anymore. You no longer had to live in fear and had to live in secrecy, so Masonry came out into the open in 1717 after the Bill of Rights in England had been passed. And all of these things are, again, documented in terms of when they happened and what happened. People have to draw their own conclusions about what exactly caused what or why exactly these things came about, but that, in fact, is the chronology of what happened. So the Masons were tremendously influential during all of this, but not in public. So if you ask, well, were they able to influence governments and cause things to happen? We'll never know.
Well, not really. I don't even like influence government. I just didn't know if they were like finally got to be part of the political world, just not because they're Masons, just happen to be Masons.
And because they were probably wanting to continue their philosophy of trying to get back to oneness and community and love.
Right. And actually, the thing that happened very fortuitously was in the United States at that time, it was all brand new. There was no past structure that they had to fight. So
no
Freemason,
religious.
no,
Yeah, you had your religious freedoms. A
lot of people picked up on the fact that they fled the other countries in Europe because of religious persecution, and they didn't want to be persecuted here. So the idea of having a brotherhood where all religions were accepted was a godsend that worked. So many people were picking up on Freemasonry here that it took root in the United States. It spread all over, and that's why it was very easy for founding fathers to be members, because other highly respected men were publicly and visibly Freemasons, and it was the right thing to do in terms of loving your brother, tolerating other religions, making things happen. So that's part of the reason why it happened to grow here for many different reasons, and we all benefited from it.
And I'm just looking at a list of people that were part of it, and Benjamin Franklin, who was a Grand Master of Pennsylvania, and what was the biggest thing that influenced building our structure here in America that Freemasons contributed to, besides religion, of freedom of religion? Because that seems like, being a member, we don't ask. Living in America, just believe what you want to believe. So what other influences that the Freemasons brought to America?
Well, some of them are small, some are profound, but one of the ones that gets in that almost nobody ever recognizes is the Constitution. There was no such thing as a Constitution before that. Historians retroactively are applying the word Constitution to many things that happened in the past, but if you look at those words in the past and what was used in the past, it was never there. In Freemasonry, each lodge had a constitution that set up how they were to conduct their business. In fact, these are also called the old charges for all of the constitutions that existed before 1717. They were all collected into a composite by a fellow named James Anderson after 1717 into constitutions of the Freemasons. And in fact, one of the things that Benjamin Franklin did as a printer and publisher he published a new American version of the Constitutions of the Freemasons in Pennsylvania in, I think it was 1734. So he made it available in written form for other people here to get that experience with Freemasonry. But the Constitution concept of people getting together and writing their own rules in a single document, that this is how we will be governed, was something that Freemasons brought first to their states. As each colony was creating its own state and forming its own government, they had a constitution for the states. And then when they sat down to form a national government, they wrote a constitution for the United States because it was the Masonic way to do things. And most people have no clue.
I actually have heard that before.
Really?
I remember watching a documentary, because I love documentaries,
Okay.
on that our Constitution was based off of their Constitution of the Masonry.
Which, if you think about it, it's a clear, pure intention in writing, which makes it more powerful. I don't want to say the word law. It just feels like this is our philosophy. This is how, if you want to be a part of this community, this is how we all act to hold this community together.
And I'm looking right now that my 7th grade grandfather, Richard Stockton, he was a charter master of St. John's Lodge in Princeton, New Jersey. So he was. I didn't know that. But so, because I'm going to go, because we only have, can you believe we're almost out of time? We have about 10 minutes left.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But we can go back to what Eddie was going to ask. You said people emailed you about some questions because the misconceptions, and I think that's fascinating because you're breaking down those walls, and this is going to be fascinating for people to listen to again and later on podcast. So if you have those questions.
I do. Well, what it is, and I'm just paraphrasing based on all of the questions that they sent, it's fascinating that what they do, most people, because they don't know, they've lumped in Illuminati, they've lumped in Freemasonry, they've lumped in secret societies, and they've also lumped in a lot of the billionaires or the top 1% who have their front people out there doing their agenda, whether it's in politics or Republican or Democrat or whatever. And so they lump all of these people that they think are bad people into one big vat when they're not even remotely connected. So Illuminati's not connected by Freemasonry, and some of the billionaires aren't connected to Freemasonry at all. Some of them probably are, some of them aren't. So that was the biggest misconception, I think, for the people that were sending in the emails. And you answered that right at the top. The biggest misconception is that we're not a religion. We all must believe in God in our unique individual way, which goes back to a form of Christianity that is about love. Fascinating.
Now, you said something about way back when that began, a knight would have to go out and get seven other people.
Investors, as it was.
So,
Sponsors.
So, you, like a Christian church or a church that have commercials running and say, come and join our church.
You can't ride on my private jet.
Right. But you, as a Mason yourself, you don't see them out there recruiting. You don't see ads.
Not.
So how do you get your members?
Okay, it's actually the reverse of that. In Masonry, you're not allowed to solicit. You cannot ask somebody, would you like to be a Mason?
They have to seek it for themselves.
You cannot do it. Somebody has to have heard about it and of their own volition originate the question, can you tell me about Masonry? I'd like to know about it. How do I become a Mason? And you'll find any Mason that I've ever met will immediately set aside whatever the heck he's doing, and he will answer every question you may have, because if you ask a Mason, tell me about Freemasonry, that's the thing they would love to tell you about. And then if after you've heard that, you get invited to a lodge, you can go in and meet the other brothers, ask all the questions you want. If it's for you, you can put in a request to join. There's still a process they have to go through to have other brothers talk to you and that kind of thing to find out. You have to like them, they have to like you, but if it works, anybody can become a Mason. But it's in every community. There is no city anywhere that I know of in the United States and many, many countries around the world where you can't, these days, go to the internet, type in Mason, type in the name of your city, and you'll find the local lodge. You can walk in and talk to a Mason anywhere, but you have to originate it.
Go ahead.
What is the average demographic for most Freemasons? Like, a lot of people think it's just white men in power. They really do.
Could well be. It is, in fact, still a requirement. And again, it gets back to the thing people say, why do Masons only men?
Yeah.
It started out as a brotherhood in Christianity, where you had to be a man to be a member of the brotherhood and be in the religious order. You had to be a man. No women were accepted. So that's been modified over time into there are now related women's organizations in the structure of Freemasonry. There's Eastern Star. There's Beauseance related to the Knights Templar. There's many other women's groups, but to be a Freemason, it's still men only.
And so, was it the how do you say it? The Knights Templar? Did they? I know it's a brotherhood. You beautifully articulated that, but it was when it's when they went from more of the earth kind of. I'm going to use the word religion because it's inappropriate by accident, but it was mostly father, mother. It was God, goddess. It was, earth-bound kind of religions or thought processes. But then, whenever it became more Christian, as it were, in the love way, when again did the women get pushed out, or not just the women, but the feminine aspect of it? I know you guys still have kind of that nice balance, but why can't the balance? Why can't the women come in? And
in fact, that is the direction of including women more, and it's happening in two different ways. Like I said, they are creating groups within Masonry where women can belong to those groups.
There's like test groups,
sort of, but it's like brotherhood, sisterhood type of thing, where women gather in some groups, men gather in some groups. Some groups are men and women both, like Eastern Star, for example.
Okay.
Some places, like in France, they actually have changed that, where some lodges decided they would have women as members, but then they had a tussle with the people who had long established with the normal order of things. So there's two different Grand Lodges in France. One has women included, one does not. And these are things that are evolutionary. Life goes on.
Yeah, well, and guess what? People don't like change. They say they want it. They say they like it. They fight for it sometimes. But what they really want a lot of times, I'm not saying this is everybody, but most people, it comes back to they want things to stay just like they are but be better. You know what I mean? That's real. It's true. But so it takes a minute to change 2,000 years of programming, as it were. So it sounds like you guys are like moving in not the right direction, but a more expanded direction of that which you already are.
It's coming along, and it's again decided by the people who are part of the organization what they want to do, what they're comfortable with, what they can make happen. In terms of what kind of people are Masons, it varies so much over the years. There are things like when there's times of warfare and people are feeling a need for a friend.
Yeah, community.
Find a lot of people become Masons. It's like it's surprising. So at the age groups, the demographics, they all shift from time to time.
That makes sense.
Now,
there's about 4 minutes.
Yeah, we have about 4 minutes left. But before we go, I want to ask, and I just had a brain fart, and I think it just went away. But no. But before we let Sanford go, I want you guys to go to sanfordholst.com, and that's HOLST.com, and pick up his book. And I'm going to show you guys the book. It's called Sworn in Secret, Freemasonry and the Knights Templar. And I cannot believe an hour and a half has gone by.
I've learned more.
I have learned so much today. This is what I was going to say. For people that, because way back when, if you were part of the noble, if you were noble, part of the royalty, you got in. So when did that change, real quick, where, like you said, anybody can join now, except, being accepted into it. But when did that change?
Well, actually, the thing with the Knights Templar came when they needed the other brothers to be part of what they're doing, and they had the secrecy that was binding them.
Right.
So the noble knights and their supporters all got together across class lines. In order to keep the secrecy, they all had to be part of the secret.
Yeah. Okay.
So they had their meetings in secret, and you started to find that nobles and people who grew up as serfs, or people who grew up of merchants' sons, were all sitting in private and meeting. And that's when it all came out of the secrecy in the meetings that were being held.
Wow.
You're fascinating.
You are.
You are so fascinating.
We've learned more in
yeah.
this interview than we have
Ever.
Yeah, in all of the other ones in the past. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And please come back. We can talk for a couple more hours.
I want to ask you if there's any law of attraction philosophy behind the secret of the Freemasons.
So hopefully you'll accept our invitation, and we really appreciate you being here. Again, for people that tuned in halfway through, you need to go back and start from the beginning.
Yeah.
Definitely. And you can go to our YouTube channel page. Just type in Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. It'll bring up our page. Subscribe. Listen to this. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. Or if you just want to listen to the audio version, you can go to iHeartRadio, which we appreciate you going there. iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, or even on our host page right here on Universal Broadcasting Network. But do you have anything else in the works? Another book coming up that you're going to surprise us with?
In 30 seconds or less.
Yeah.
There's always the next thing, but this summer I'm going back to Greece again to pick up the story of the Phoenicians with the classical Athens and all the things that happened then. So it's a follow-on to the whole Phoenician story with a lot of amazing things happened with the Greeks. I've been there before, but I'm going back again, and it's all joy.
Yay,
Well,
thank you for doing that.
Yes, thank you, because we need more
Yeah, and we'll have you
history
back.
brought to our table, and then
He
everybody else.
loves history.
I do
do too.
All right, well, thank you again, and we are out, so you want to stick around. We have another great show right after this, and we hope you stick around for that. Again, thank you so much, Eddie Connor. Appreciate you as always. Sanford, thank you. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
And you're listening to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie right here on Universal Broadcasting Network. Have a good one.